So,
Hi,
Erek,
you hear me
if
okay?
you want to
Okay,
take that
yes.
away,
Yeah.
fabulous.
Yeah, as long as you can hear me okay, I will get started.
Yeah.
Great. Greetings from Brooklyn, New York. Just as a heads up, the city's had a bunch of major power outages recently. So if there's any internet issues, let me know. I'll get going back as fast as possible. And I just want to take a second up top to say thank you so much to everyone organizing this and for having me. It's very humbling and honoring to be amongst such great scholars, especially as somebody who just finished his bachelor's degree at 34 years old. So it's very, very fun for me. I want to talk today about dehumanization. My interest started in looking at the phenomenon of dehumanization. And obviously everyone's familiar with the phenomenon and there's been a lot of writing and great research on it, but an observation I made in my estimation is that a lot of writing on dehumanization misses a very big, fundamental, basic, obvious point, which is that why do we have dehumanization? Well, we have dehumanization because there is a hierarchy of animals. You can't treat someone as being less than human if there's no concept of being less than human, right? So this opens up this big Pandora's box of ideas. The most prescient for me is the idea that this sort of exposes the idea of the human as not just a species classification. It's not a simple biological tool, but it's actually a socially constructed object. And when we talk about who gets counted as human and who doesn't, and all these tactics of dehumanization and lowering people to being less than human, we're not talking about literally saying that somebody is of a different species, but we're saying that they are not, we don't need to give them the same moral considerations for humans. Because when we establish this hierarchy of animals with humans being at the top, we understand that there are certain moral considerations that we have to give other human beings. And so if we can reduce other people to being less than human, then we no longer have to afford them those moral considerations. So I think it's worth exploring why we have this animal hierarchy and what to do about it. I want to build upon some existing theory and some existing research, most notably John Bellamy Foster, Richard Dwork, and Brett Clark have done a great job of theorizing and making popular the idea of the ecological rift, where they sort of take on some of Marx's ideas about the alienation of human and nature and expand upon it. But the interesting thing that I find is a lot of their work, and this is the same problem with Marx, is that it sort of locates all of these issues between humans and nature within capitalism. And I think that's a huge problem, certainly, but I think the issue is more fundamental than that. And I actually think that Marx, in his historical materialist approach, has all the right tools for the analysis. He just didn't go far enough because of his own biases. So I wanted to just expand on his work a little bit and try to create a holistic framework for analyzing this issue and tying these different issues together of alienation and then also dehumanization and hierarchies in human society. So Marx takes this idea from Ludwig Feuerbach, and he says, paraphrasing obviously, but he says the basic idea is that humans are special creatures because of our ability to produce for our own needs. Now, other animals build things, but humans are special because of their productive capacity to meet their own needs through production and labor. And I think he's right about this. I think it just needs to be expanded a little bit. I do think there's something to this idea that humans have a fundamental mode of production that is different from other animals. Other animals are foragers in that they meet all their needs through either hunting or gathering. They're at the whims of the nature around them, and then whereas humans can now produce, not only can we build tools to gather, or hunt, but we can actually produce more than what is available already in nature. And I think there's something to this idea, but he doesn't go far enough back in time and see that there was a time when humans weren't that way. And I think that we can locate this in the Neolithic Revolution around 2000 BC, because before that, when that revolution happens, that's when humans, invent, whatever you want to call it, invent or figure out or whatever. But that's when humans start agriculture. So the beginnings of agriculture and also importantly the domestication of animals. Before this time, I go to the next slide here. Yeah. So before this time, before we have agriculture and animal domestication, humans are foragers. Now, I think you could, make an argument. You can make the case that humans may have been the most advanced species, whatever that means, or that they're, most technologically advanced, yada, yada. But they shared a fundamental playing field with other animals. We were all subject to the same ecological whims, and we all had the same processes, just different variations of it. We're all hunters or gatherers. All animals share this mode of production. And it's also important that at that time, you could think of humans as just another species. I mean, this is another thing that has always interested me, is that everyone knows that humans are animals, but we don't treat ourselves as animals. We treat ourselves as something distinct from other animals. So this is how I got interested in this topic. And so pre-agriculture, humans are a participant in a dynamic ecosystem, a holistic ecosystem, a complex food chain. There's all these forces, going on, but humans are a participant along with other animals. It's after the development of agriculture and the domestication of animals when you could say that the metaphysics of what being a human is sort of changes. Because after that, humans start to settle down, they start to create the basis of human civilization and settlements. And they go from being a participant in nature to now actually being in control of nature. They're able to farm and change how things grow. They're able to domesticate animals and actually change the animals. And they're able to produce however many animals that they need, as opposed to just being at the whims of what exists. And so this is a fundamental change for humans and their role in the ecosystem. And so it's, I think this is a fundamental shift that Marx is talking about when he says that humans are special creatures because of their ability to produce. I think this is the moment when it happens. And you see that once this happens, humans take on a whole new role in the ecosystem, and they start to develop ethics and philosophy and codes that basically give humans free range over all of nature and animals. Because now, like I said, instead of being a participant in nature, they are actually controlling all of nature. And so now the earth basically exists for humans as opposed to humans being a part of it. And so this goes on obviously for thousands of years. And then later, when we start to develop actual like written codes, written morals, philosophy, ethics, you see a lot of cultures develop post hoc justifications for this. You see a lot of world religions where human dominion over animals is encoded into the religion. I mean, this is a very basic tenet of Christianity, and also Aristotle actually literally wrote a hierarchy of animals, which becomes sort of a part of the canon of Western ethics and philosophy. So it's encoded. It was a fact of life that then even just becomes encoded in the written moral philosophy that guides the rest of civilization. It's worth noting that not every culture shared this view. I mean, the one that always comes to mind for me first is Jainism. They're fiercely anti-speciesist. They don't step on bugs. They preach, the sanctity of life for all creatures. But these are usually smaller. These are not as prominent, and their ideas didn't spread throughout the world the same way that having dominion over animals and nature did spread throughout the world. And part of what's interesting here is that by encoding this in what it means to be a human being, essentially, being human means to have dominion over animals and nature, to have control of the earth. Like I said, I think that what Marx and then later these modern sociologists located, the idea that capitalism exacerbates this relation between humans and animals. I think it's so fundamental to being human to have dominion over animals and nature, that it follows the same processes of society that the rest of society goes through. So when we move into modernization and capitalism, of course, we already have given ourselves the moral authority to have dominion over the animals. So of course, it makes sense that when we start an economic system based on commodities, that these things are going to be commodities. And then it exacerbates the issue even more, because as we develop new tools, if we develop machines, and as our alienation from labor starts to expand, so too does our alienation from animals and nature expand. And you see this as we get further and further through the modernization process, from modernization into postmodernism, and from capitalism. Our tie with nature is actually getting further and further away as well. I mean, we see it tracks just the same as it does with alienation from labor. And then it's also important to point out too that this has a lot of effects as by not being tied to nature, because there are certain ecological and biological realities. There's a problem with thinking of ourselves as the only important creature, and everything else in nature and animals being subservient to humans and being, for our own use, being specifically here for whatever we want to use them for, because there are these ecological systems that we depend on that we don't see because we're so alienated from the system itself. The one that always comes to my mind is, the bee population. Humans don't like bees. They sting you. They're annoying. They're pests. But they're, absolutely vital to all of life. They're absolutely vital to the entire food chain. But as humans are becoming more and more alienated from nature, we have no idea. We don't face any of these consequences. So like I said, pre-agriculture, when you live in sort of a dynamic ecosystem, there are certain forces at work. And so if you're a predator and you eat all of your prey, you either starve or you have to adapt. When humans develop the capacity to produce for their own needs, we sort of found a way to circumvent all of these natural forces that could tell us something is wrong. And so now we can't even notice when ecological problems happen, because we no longer are facing the consequences of them until it's too late, until it's complete collapse, until it's complete ecological collapse. So there's very real, it's not just a philosophical problem. There are very real problems to humans having such an anthropocentric approach to what the world is supposed to be like. And so we're seeing that now, where there's more and more animals going extinct, ecosystems collapsing, all these things. There's just, we have to be able to see all these things happening. We can't just, wait until it all collapses, because it's the only time we're going to notice it. And there are the ecological consequences. And then my point here too, in talking about dehumanization and the alienation between humans and animals, is that it also causes problems for human society. So it's not just saying for the sake of anti-speciesism that this is bad, but it actually causes our own issues. It actually causes issues within human society. And it shouldn't take causing our own problems for us to address the issue, but it's worth pointing out that it does. Because as I was saying in talking about dehumanization, once you've established this hierarchy of animals, once you've said, well, humans are a dominant species and they have dominion over the earth, over all nature, all animals, well then, you've established a hierarchy, and it doesn't make sense in that it's good, but you can see why then, once that's sort of encoded into what being a human is, what human civilization is, then people are going to start trying to determine who gets the count in that. So if this is part of human civilization that we have dominion over the animals, well then if you relegate another group of humans to being less than human, to being animals, then you get to treat them like animals, which we've established means you get to do whatever you want with them and they're there for your use, right? So you see this a lot in colonialist literature about and propaganda about civilizing the savage. It's a popular tactic in war and genocide. If you can relegate your enemy to an animal, if you can rhetorically change their metaphysical nature and say these people are animals, then you've established a precursor for giving them all the same moral considerations that we give animals, which is not good. And it also, it lines up with a lot of new psychological research showing that people who believe in human supremacy also very highly correlated with believing in other parts of human supremacy, because understanding one type of hierarchy is just understanding all the other different types of hierarchy. So once you've established one, you can establish the others. And it's my argument that this is the fundamental one, because this is the first change we see in human development from the pre-agriculture to the post-agriculture. And I think this is what sets up further hierarchies in human society. So it's also worth exploring, where do we go from here? Thinking about these ideas, it's very easy to fall into, wanting, fall into, a primitive mindset of wanting to eradicate civilization and go back to, the natural way of life. But I just don't, those might be tempting ideas, but I just don't, that's just not happening. So I think what's important to take away here is that the human supremacy over nature and animals has to be an integral part in, if we're going to eradicate all hierarchies, those have also got to go. We've got to understand human supremacy over animals and nature as an integral part of all other forms of hierarchy, because they're connected. And so if we get rid of all the other ones, but we don't get this one, they won't go away. So understanding, making this a big part of eradicating hierarchy, having an ecological imagination, having, understanding humans as animals situated in an ecosystem rather than a special being that, has dominion over animals in nature, I think is so important to not just eradication of hierarchy and justice, but also just in general, when we talk about the sociological imagination, I think understanding, humans, not just in history of society, but also in history of the ecosystem, and understanding humans as an animal situated in the ecosystem. It's got to be a part of our sociological imagination. And then, when it comes to modernization, alienation from nature and modernization, I think I'm sort of warm to the idea of alternative proteins and new ways of getting people off eating meat. There was a really interesting Faunalytics study about ex-vegetarians and ex-vegans, where they talked about most people that started vegetarian veganism did so because of compassion for animals or animal rights issues, but most of them, around 85%, eventually go back to eating meat. And the number one reason for that, the only majority reason, is because they weren't happy with the food. So they didn't lose their compassion, but it's just, what we eat and what we identify with eating is so ingrained in us in humans that I think this is a good way to get past that, if we can use these alternative proteins to get people who are interested in this idea, to get them latched onto it, so they don't go back. And so I think this is a great way to get people interested in the idea. Of course, the moral case is always going to be the most compelling. It just doesn't always work for getting people to keep that thing going. And so I think this can be an interesting use of it. And then also, I think everything has to be rethought in terms of when we're thinking about an ecological imagination. What does it mean? I know a lot of animal liberationists are very anti-pets. I sympathize with the idea that humans shouldn't own animals, but also we've had so many centuries, millennia of domesticating animals that now at this point it seems like we have an obligation to take care of them. So I don't have an answer for that one, but it's got to be, these types of things, how we build communities. I'm from the South originally and grew up in a family of hunters and around hunters. And when I first started going vegetarian, everybody's, snappy comeback was that we have to kill deer because they're overpopulated. We have to control the population because they're getting into the neighborhoods. And, with an ecological imagination, with understanding that, with being able to get rid of this speciesist, dominion over animals, it doesn't make sense. I mean, it was never an argument that made sense to me that like we have to kill deer because they're coming in our neighborhoods. We shouldn't have built the neighborhoods in the first place. And so, I think a lot of these things have to be rethought with this new frame of thinking about how humans relate to other animals and nature, and eradicating this dominion over animals and nature. And I think we can do that and still have a modern human society. So that's all I've got. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Erek. That was an excellent presentation. I've been just going over the chat here, and we sparked, people are sharing some wonderful content that might be related to this. There's an article and a chapter, and some connecting ideas. And I'm going to, all the links are right there in the chat, so everyone will be able to access them after. So very great thought. I see the people are really thinking. They felt as kind of this accumulating, it became the final presentation of the day, or night, or wherever people are, in the final presentation of our section here. And people are really feeling a lot of, as a whole, every little piece that's been added in this one as well has really been super valuable to not just to grow our reading list, but to grow our ideas in our group and our what we're trying to do, generally anyways. So, and I think I do have a question or two here that we could talk about though. I think the first one, I'm trying to make sure I don't miss anyone, is Yasmin. It looks like Yasmin. And she's asking, do you think findings on non-human animals' use of tools has disrupted our conceptualization of humans? For example, Jane Goodall's research on chimpanzees tool making. Or is the human-animal distinction more pronounced with humans in relation to domesticated animals? For instance, those robbed of their species being opportunities for free conscious activity. That's Yasmin's question.
Yeah, that's interesting. I know some, I actually know a couple of people in New York that have been working on a pretty famous lawsuit to win personhood rights for chimpanzees.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I know who you're talking about.
Yeah. It's a super interesting concept. I've been thinking about that a lot too, because that was another thing where I think it's very interesting that in order to get animal rights, we have to get them personhood. So it's also still so ingrained that we have to make a chimpanzee a human basically in order to to say that they deserve rights. I do think the tool use thing is interesting. I mean, I would hope so. I definitely did for me when I was younger, and getting into vegetarianism and learning that other animals have culture, other animals have tools, other animals have feelings and emotions. I mean, I think learning about that stuff is a radical thought for a lot of people, because we don't get taught that, and a lot of people don't understand. And that's why I say too that I think we can locate sort of the divide in humans and animals in sort of the productive capacity, because animals have all the things that we do. They have emotions, they have thoughts, they have some animals have self-conception. I mean, we're just talking about degrees of variation over what we have over them. So that seems to be the only fundamental difference is that difference in production versus foraging, because animals have just as many things as we have. They're just maybe a different time on the evolutionary scale, or they're just not are just different. We always think of ourselves as more complex, but they're honestly, most of the times, they're just different.
That's good. That's one way I often will, if people say the argument is so common that they're just nothing like us. Right. I challenge them to can you give me an example where they are kind of like us? And then they start, I like to just, people who don't have any interest at all, to see if they can come up with something. It's fascinating to see where they go. Right. Yeah, it's always an interesting, I hope it does what we're doing here is it's bringing out the links, and that are sometimes either just we're completely in cognitive dissonance, or don't want to see or can't see, which is, we've talked about, which is legitimate too. Right. The viewing, but I don't want to talk too much. There's a question or a comment, at least from Rochelle, that regarding companion animals, there's an argument that shifting to a more reflective language to refer to our relationships, like guardian, companion, instead
Right.
of all the other terms we've been using, is to move past the ownership angle that there's obviously still there.
Yeah, I think I do like that a lot. I like companion animal or guardian, or because it does, I think, frame the relationship better, where it's like we have to stop thinking of ourselves as owning animals and more like, I like the argument that it is sort of like, I mean, it's an obligation at this point, especially for certain domesticated animals like dogs and cats, that humans have changed over time so much that now they couldn't even be wild if they wanted to, you know? And so we do sort of have this obligation to take care of them because we did this to them.
That's a good point. Yes, it's always a good point to bring up as well. We have a Roger, I believe it's Roger. Roger's commented, we don't have to get other animals' rights. The case for animal rights says that they have them already, but they are not respected. So that's kind of what we've been discussing. That's the difference between moral and legal rights.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that is certainly how I would like to frame it. I think from the sort of like legal world, I think they obviously see it the opposite way. That we, and I think the challenge is going to be getting them on that level. And it's hard. I mean, honestly, but I think that's got to be the goal.
Yeah, I think I'll just end. Is any other questions that are popping up in the feed? We have a lot of comments here. I can end on the next comment that was there, which is there's so many great things being said. Brett Mills said that the other problem with the debate about whether animals are like us, because it always tends to go back to are they like humans or not, is the assumption that there's a coherent, stable category of us in the first place. These are really, really brilliant points. They're very obvious. They're hard to understand. They're hard to tackle. And when you start going into, we're crossing into philosophy and some really cool areas, you could go on. But it's wonderful to have the insight coming out here. So thank you. Thank you for your presentation. It was excellent.
Thank you.
And thank you to everybody who attended. Rochelle and I are so happy that you did, and all the other wonderful people who made this happen. And some people, I don't know how Zoe's still there. I think Zoe's still there somehow. Yes, she is. Or at least her computer's there. Hi, Zoe. You're still there. It's incredible. And Corey, it's so wonderful. Everyone was able to see so much of it.
I'm about to head out to the pub. I've been sitting in this hot bar